Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I acknowledge the Prime Minister's apologies for the very late arrival of her statement to my office, and I understand the reasons for it. I met with the survivors at Grenfell Tower, as have a number of colleagues in the House, and very inspiring volunteers coordinating so much of the relief effort for families who had lost so much. There is grief, there is anger, and there is also great solidarity in that community. And I hope the whole House will join with me in commending the community spirit and public support which helped so many traumatised families, and the amazing response of so many local people and faith groups who rushed to the scene to give clothing, to give food, to give help, and to provide a sort of online restaurant for just about anybody who was helping with the disaster relief. Our love, our condolences and our solidarity goes out to those families again today, and in what will be the very difficult days and weeks ahead, and for many a lifetime will be reliving the trauma of that dreadful night. They were, as the Prime Minister said yesterday, let down, both in the immediate aftermath and so cruelly beforehand, and the public inquiry must establish the extent and by whom. At least 79 people are dead. It is both a tragedy and an outrage, because every single one of those deaths could and should have been avoided. The Grenfell Tower residents themselves had raised concerns about the lack of fire safety in the block. The Grenfell Action Group had warned, and I quote, "It is a truly terrifying thought, but the Grenfell Action Group firmly believes that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation." The Prime Minister said it is right that the CEO of Kensington and Chelsea Council has now resigned. It may be, but why aren't the political leaders of Kensington and Chelsea taking responsibility as well for this whole dreadful event? Mr. Speaker, from Hillsborough to the child sex abuse scandal to Grenfell Tower, the pattern is consistent. Working class people's voices are ignored, their concerns dismissed by those in power. The Grenfell Tower residents and North Kensington community deserve answers, and thousands of people living in tower blocks around the country need very urgent reassurance. Our very brave firefighters must never have to deal with such a horrific incident again. And the Prime Minister is right when she talks about the bravery of firefighters running into a burning building. I've spoken to firefighters on many occasions, but they're overstretched and they're traumatised. Traumatised by dealing with London Bridge, traumatised by Grenfell Tower, yet they carry on doing it, overstretched and understaffed. We need to look at the whole issue of the security of our fire service. Those of us, Mr. Speaker, with over 30 years' experience in this House would have struggled as constituency MPs under the pressure generated by an incident of this scale. And as I said yesterday, my honourable friend, the member for Kensington, deserves praise for the tireless and diligent way she stood up for her constituents in the very short time since she was thankfully elected to this House. Her constituents need answers, and the public inquiry must address. Firstly, the appalling failure of the fire alarms at Grenfell Tower, which meant many residents reported they were only alerted to the fire by the screams of their neighbours or by young Muslim men banging on the door who had broken from prayers in order to try and save life. Something went catastrophically wrong, which lost life. And whether the advice given to tenants to stay in their homes was correct, and what advice should be given to the people living in the 4,000 other tower blocks around this country in the event of similar disaster. Why sprinklers were not installed, and whether they should now be retrofitted into all tower blocks. We need urgent answers to that question. And whether the cladding used was illegal, as the Chancellor has suggested, and whether it should be banned entirely, and what wider changes must be urgently made to building regulations. As the Prime Minister indicated in her statement, that this is obviously being urgently addressed. But we also need to address the fire prevention regulations, including the frequency and enforcement of fire safety checks, because it is my suspicion that many local authorities, strapped for cash after 7 years of cuts, have cut back on fire testing, cut back on inspections, because they simply haven't got the staff to do it anymore. And whether the tenant management organisations are responsive enough to their tenants, and what greater powers tenants need, both in council, social housing or the private sector, to ensure their own safety. Whether survivors and people evacuated from adjacent property were rehoused promptly and adequately, the Prime Minister has addressed some of that. I'd be interested in her response to those that lived nearby, who themselves are equally traumatised by the event. And of course they should be rehoused within the borough, and I hope there will be no increase in their rent. The inquiry must also address the resources available to the Fire and Rescue Service, and whether response times and capacity are adequate for all areas of the country, since the number of wards in which response time targets are not being met has increased tenfold since 2011. Lessons must be learned in the public inquiry, and a disaster that should never have happened must never happen again. The government must delay no longer, and now implement the recommendations of the 2013 inquiry report into the Lakenal House fire. The public inquiry into Grenfell Tower must also establish whether lives could have been saved if those recommendations had been implemented in full, and if the recommendations of the all-party parliamentary group had been heeded by government. Fire safety measures cannot be left to a postcode lottery. So I ask the government to make available emergency funds, as my honourable friend, the member for Leeds West, raised yesterday, so that councils can carry out immediate fire safety checks and install sprinklers, and the timetable for that be made known to residents. There is obviously a huge cost involved in removing and recladding blocks that are found to have flammable materials included in them. That money must be made available immediately, because it is a huge job of work. And when the Prime Minister says that those people who are in danger must be moved out of their properties, this is a massive undertaking, and a huge focus of government resources will have to go into it. Will the Prime Minister also ensure that the counselling and mental health services, which you referred to as going on at the Westway Sports Centre now, are available to all the residents, both of Grenfell Tower and of the remaining areas around there, and those who witnessed it on the Lancaster West estate, including those in the emergency services who've been through such trauma over the last few days? Because counselling and mental health services are important in the days and weeks after the tragedy, but they have to go on for a very long time. This trauma doesn't end a few days afterwards. Mr. Speaker, the public inquiry must report as soon as possible, and changes that can and should have been made must now be made without delay. But we have to be aware that this has been a wake-up call to the whole country. The fire at Grenfell Tower has taken the lives of people who should be with us and alive and happy today. Residents of tower blocks all over the country are concerned, worried and frightened for their own safety. What we need is a step change in our attitude towards housing in this country, to deal with the permanent housing crisis that so many of our constituents and residents face. And we need government intervention to support local authorities in bringing about safe solutions to the housing crisis, so that this tragedy can at least change our attitudes and at least say, as a country, we are seriously going to address the housing situation that so many people face. Those people have died. They will never come back. We have to learn those lessons to make sure this tragedy is a turning point in our whole attitude, and never again do people die needlessly in a towering inferno, living in poverty, surrounded by a sea of prosperity. Yeah.